This is Robert Kraft, and I'm your host on SNN.Network. And joining me today, all the way from Melbourne, Australia, Mr. Brad O'Connor. He is the CEO of Cogstate. It's a publicly traded company. I got two symbols for you. It is CGS on the ASX and COGZF in the US. Brad, welcome to this SNN Live. Good to see you. Thank you for joining me.
No, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. So let's start first off with a quick description and history of Cogstate. The floor is yours, my friend.
Sure, thank you. So Cogstate's been around for 20 years. The company originated in Australia, as you can tell from the accent. But largely speaking, we're a US-based company now. So really came into existence trying to solve this problem of how do you measure cognition in across different countries and different people, different backgrounds, education backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, where many of the conventional measures of cognition assume a standard, level of education and standard cultural background. And the idea was, can we use technology to facilitate that and make that assessment of cognition simpler?
Got it. Okay. So for those who may not be too familiar with the story, what is then the product or the service that you're selling specifically using that technology itself? Technology, correct?
Correct. Yeah. We're a technology, one part science company, one part technology company. So we're companies formed by neuropsychologists and neurologists, but then based on technology platforms. So largely our customers are pharmaceutical companies who are developing new drugs. So that might be in Alzheimer's disease or in Parkinson's disease or other central nervous system type diseases, where they're trying to essentially improve the way that people are thinking, right? So if you think in Alzheimer's disease, we're trying to stop that decline in the way that people think. Or similarly in other indications where someone's developing a new drug, but they might be worried that that drug might have an adverse consequence on the way people think. So it might have a side effect. Mm-hmm. And so what we're providing them with is really simple tools that very accurately measure people's cognition and whether that has changed, and essentially answer that question of, did this drug change the way that this person thinks?
So in essence, you're the test that all these companies that may have a clinical trial for any type of neurocognitive disease, you're that test that they use during the clinical trials to see if there's been any improvement, if the drug has been efficacious, correct?
Correct. Okay. But similarly, we work in things, for example, we work in oncology, mm-hmm. where obviously you're not trying to make people think better, but you might be worried that the chemotherapy, for example, may have a negative effect on the way people think. So we work as a safety endpoint in those measures as well, in those studies.
Gotcha. So I have to ask then, what was the previous, tests that were used, and how would you say yours is different and unique compared to those?
Yeah, so certainly a number of what we call conventional measures of cognition continue to be used in clinical drug trials. So that's, when I say conventional measure of cognition, it's a neuropsychologist sitting opposite a patient and running through a list of questions. The problem with those are there's cultural validation issues around those tests. So largely speaking, they've been developed with an English-speaking audience in mind, assuming at least a high school level of education, etc. And so the problem with a global clinical trial is, can you use that same assessment in Russia, in China, in Italy, and because clinical trials are an exercise in statistics, so you're trying to reduce error in clinical trials. And where you're taking one test that's written for an English audience and translating it and taking it into different cultures, you introduce error into that. So what we've done is develop computerized assessments. So the advantage of that are that you don't need an expert neuropsychologist to deliver the assessment. Largely speaking, the computer is delivering the assessment. It doesn't take into account, so it's free of cultural biases. So we use standard game-like stimuli, and we ask questions about that, which then don't bring into place these cultural biases. Equally, it's free of language. So you don't have to go through this enormous translation process that you do for most tests. And we've been able to show that those tests are really sensitive. So we've been able to, we've over 400 peer-reviewed publications now supporting the validity of the technology in different patient populations and in different drug classes. So we've been able to show at least equivalence to those other standard assessments of cognition, and in many cases we've been able to show superiority against those, but with this advantage of using technology. And so largely speaking, a lot of what we're doing is the move from or the move towards computerized assessments just as a general thing, and and the obvious advantages of things like electronic data points as opposed to analog data points.
For sure. So then what then is the size of this total addressable market? Because it sounds like your first indication to start is Alzheimer's, but obviously there's other applications. So what is the total addressable market for your tests? And then how fast is this TAM, total addressable market, shortened for TAM?
Yes.
How fast is that growing and why?
Yeah, so total addressable market, in clinical trials, we break down to central nervous system diseases, which is things like Alzheimer's disease, so where we're trying to make people think better. It's hard to put an estimate around that total addressable market, but there's been some research done that suggests that that's around about a $400 to $600 million annual market. In just those central nervous system diseases. You then spread out to that into the safety endpoints. And so the total addressable market there is much larger, but it depends on, you don't measure cognition as a safety endpoint in every study. What we're seeing is a real trend of, particularly in pediatric studies, where the regulators are enforcing the measure of cognition as a safety endpoint in those studies. But the total addressable market in safety endpoint is estimated to be over $2 billion. But that assumes, so $2 billion per annum. But that assumes that every study would measure cognition as a safety endpoint, which isn't the case, right? So it's some subset thereof, and then. For us, the much larger market opportunity, and one we've always been focused on, is actually outside of clinical drug trials. So it's in the context of your primary care physician. So if we've just met, but you look very young. So if your parents or your grandparents were going to their doctor and said, look, I'm worried about my memory. What does the primary care physician do in that situation? The reality is that a standard consultation time doesn't allow for a primary care physician to really accurately measure someone's cognition. And so one of our focus areas has always been, can we provide technology that allows for that assessment of cognition to be done independent of the primary care physician, so that they're just looking at data and analyzing data as opposed to trying to do the assessment themselves in the context of a standard consultation time. So that market is essentially everybody over the age of 65 across the planet measuring themselves 2, 3, 4 times per year to establish whether their brain and their memory is performing within normative ranges, but more importantly, is it the same as it was 6 months ago or last year or the year before that? And that's an enormous market opportunity, and one that's really just now starting to come online as a commercial opportunity for us.
That's actually a perfect segue, because it sounds like from what I've read and reading about the company prior to our interview, is that it looks like you guys are trying to assess the landscape, position yourselves in that way. So, in that regard, what would you say is the current landscape for Alzheimer's drugs, and how could Cogstate benefit from the commercialization of Alzheimer's treatments?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. So, excitingly, in August of 2019, Biogen announced, the pharmaceutical biopharm company Biogen announced that their drug aducanumab, which had previously actually failed in its clinical trial, or they'd stop that study early. They announced that on a full data analysis there, that they actually found that drug had worked in the target population and had, I suppose more importantly, achieved statistical significance in that analysis. And so they announced at that time their plan to file a new drug application in respect of that. So, and they plan to do that this year, 2020. So the potential is that that's the first disease-modifying drug for Alzheimer's that could be released onto the market. So from our point of view, as we've thought about commercializing a cognitive test to the community, a precursor to successful launch of that has always been the idea that you have a treatment for Alzheimer's disease. So what is my reason to test? So the release of a disease-modifying therapy suddenly gives people a reason to test. I like to use the analogy of cholesterol. So before the launch of Lipitor, the most successful cholesterol-lowering drug, we always had the ability to measure cholesterol. People didn't do it because why would I bother, right? The release of the drug, suddenly, you saw this enormous spike in the number of people measuring cholesterol. Right? Think of that analogy of the launch of the therapeutic then causes a need to, so what's a nice, easy, low-cost, non-invasive way that we can measure, cognition and try and use that as a gateway measure to try and, establish further investigation of that person and whether they need to go onto drug. So the news from Biogen was really important. Interestingly, at the same time, so I should note that drug's being co-developed by Biogen and a Japanese company called Eisai. At the same time as Biogen announced that their news in respect of their drug, we actually announced that we'd partnered with Eisai for them to launch our technology to consumers and to physicians in Japan. So we entered into a 10-year exclusive license, so they'll be directly selling our product. In fact, they just did a press release this week to press release the launch of that product on the 31st of March. So in the next couple of days, that'll be launched to the Japanese consumers. Initially, they'll focus on businesses, so businesses who are wanting to test their employees and provide that as part of an annual health check that they provide to their employees, and equally to municipalities who will be testing their local residents as part of annual health checks that go on there. But they'll also be doing this direct to consumer, so via smartphone applications and online portals where people will be able to take this test at home. And that's one of the key advantages about what we provide, is that our tests can be done unsupervised by people in their own home, and that data can feed directly to their primary care physician, which will enable decision making.
So again, another perfect segue because I want to talk about some recent news and regarding the partnerships that you had with Eisai, and you can correct my pronunciation. Hopefully I said it correctly. But with Eisai and ADDF as well as Bill Gates. So can you elaborate on some of these partnerships?
Yeah. So as I said, the Eisai one's, it's critically important to us. And I think for us really represents a change for our company completely, because, we've had that as sort of one of the things we wanted to do commercially, for the best part of 20 years. But of course, the clinical drug trial market was they were the people who were paying our bills, and we had to wait for the right opportunity. So the ability to launch for the first time our technology directly to consumers is a huge opportunity for us. And I think important to understand that in Japan, the aging population. So there's about 120 million people in Japan. About a third of those, about 40 million people, are over the age of 65. 25% of them are over the age of 75. They have over 120,000 people in Japan over the age of 100. So it's a really old society. So management of cognition and dementia is really important in terms of management of their whole health economic situation. So that's really exciting for us. As part of that partnership, they'll actually be funding a lot of development work for us. So the deal terms are, we got an upfront royalty payment of $1 million US. They invested a further $2 million and became a shareholder in Cogstate, so they own about 7% of the company. They will fund all development work that we need to do to adapt the technology specifically for a consumer audience. And they will fund all the sales and marketing activities. And then we share the profits of the distribution 50-50. Probably just as important as all the other commercial terms for us is their funding of our R&D efforts. So we're taking our technology at the moment is limited to laptop or a tablet, so an iPad type technology, and we haven't yet gone down to the small screen sizes of a smartphone. Obviously, if you're working towards a consumer audience, really smartphone is critical. One of the things that Eisai is funding is the transfer of our technology from that tablet-based to a smartphone-based technology. So they're funding, and that work is going on at the moment. You mentioned the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation. So this is a group that exists to promote advances in Alzheimer's disease research. They recently partnered with Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation, as well as a number of other philanthropic backers, and they established what they call a diagnostics accelerator. So this is there's about $100 million worth of funds available now to go towards research to establish new diagnostic techniques in Alzheimer's disease. So we've just been given a grant of around $1.4 million from that foundation to establish a new, again, smartphone-based test of cognition. This one will actually be focused on voice, so it'll be an audio recording. Again, thinking about an aging population and just trying to make that interface as easy as possible. We've got some well-validated tests that we use currently, and we're translating that to a voice assessment where, rather than having a neuropsychologist or someone conduct an assessment, essentially Siri or Alexa or your tool of choice will essentially conduct the assessment. It'll all be voice recorded, and that analysis will happen instantaneously.
And what's your background? I mean, how'd you come into all this?
So I've actually got a finance background. I did tax law for a number of years. I worked at PricewaterhouseCoopers. So I'm a little left of where I originally started, but so I came into Cogstate as the CFO originally. That was in 2004. I took over as CEO at the end of 2005, and have been in this role ever since.
Perfect. And I have to also ask, what does the competitive landscape look like? I mean, I would have to imagine that there might be other companies similar to you guys that are developing similar technologies.
Well, so there's certainly the competitors differ depending on the market segment. So within the clinical trials market, there are large companies who are set up really around the provision of those conventional measures of cognition that I mentioned before. And that tends to be, within clinical trials, surprisingly, that's still a substantial, or the substantial way that cognition is measured, using those conventional measures and a trained neuropsychologist or a neurologist administering those tests, which is really expensive, but that tends to be the way that it's still predominantly conducted. And so we have some large competitors in that space. In the idea of those building computerized measures of cognition, there's a number of smaller companies that we would consider competitors in that. I mean, if you Googled online cognitive test, you'll see hundreds of them. Largely speaking, not particularly well validated, and a lot of them are sort of pretty basic reaction time type tests. So we tend to trade on the 400 peer-reviewed publications, the scientific backing in respect of our technology as differentiators between those sort of newer, smaller companies, but certainly no large companies that are well set up in terms of delivering online or computer-assisted cognitive assessments.
Gotcha. All right, I promise. Only 2 more questions, but this next one's it's going to be a multi-question question. But here we go. Yep. So from them, what you can tell us, what are some of the company's goals in terms of reaching profitability, as well as your growth strategies in both the clinical trials market and this one I got as a request, and you can answer how you will. But what do you think the company looks like in 5 years?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of profitability, that's actually an easier one to answer. So we've told the market that we will be EBIT profitable financial year 21. So we work on a June financial year. So for the 12 months to June 2021, we intend to be profitable. We've seen huge growth in contract sales, which will then drive growth in revenue as part of our clinical trials business over the last 9 months particularly. So for the period from 1 July to 31st of March, we will, that 9-month period will exceed any 12-month period in terms of sales contracts that we've executed throughout our history. So we're on a high growth phase at the moment within that clinical trials business. And then on top of that, of course, we've started now to move into this market outside of clinical trials, that primary care physician market. We're seeing good growth there. As I said, profitable financial year 21. In terms of how we look forward and what does that growth continue to look like, we're still seeing substantial growth in the clinical trials market. And of course, the unknown additional growth aspect at the moment is what happens with that Biogen drug. Does that get FDA approval? Does that get launched? And what impact then does that have on our ability to drive additional revenues from that direct-to-consumer market? That's a little harder to quantify at the moment because obviously there's some aspects of that are outside of our control, but we're continuing to work and have conversations with those parties to try and make sure that our solution is part of the commercial solution there of how do you drive patients to doctors and essentially get them on drug. So that's a big part of our focus. As to what that then looks like in 5 years' time, assuming you get a Biogen drug approved, there's a number of other therapies that are sort of, or potential therapies that are coming, down the clinical trials pipeline, but, close behind that. So we see, hopefully, a number of new therapies for Alzheimer's disease coming on market. We believe that then changes behavior so that, measurement of cognition becomes, similar to measurement of cholesterol, and that common in terms of part of just ongoing health management. And that provides an opportunity then for, whether it be Cogstate or some other provider, to come in and say, look, here's a really low cost, non-invasive way that you can do this and really capture that market. So we've got, that's execution risk. We need to go out and make sure that we end up being that provider of that technology and that solution. But I think we're better placed than anybody else to do that, given the scientific validity of our tests, the existing relationships we have with these large pharmaceutical companies that comes from our work in that space. So we're well known, well understood and respected. And now that we're moving and understanding that, that opening up that market will require move to smartphone type devices and really easy to use consumer engagement, I think we're well positioned to capture that market.
And where can audience go and find more information about Cogstate?
So you can look at the investor section of the Cogstate website. I try and do, every time we do investor roadshows, I try and make sure that we do videos of those. And so you can go to that and you can see videos. If you're interested in understanding more about the Eisai partnership, for example, there's a video that I did with their head of strategy within Eisai. So there's a video of both of us talking about the Eisai partnership. So those kind of materials we try and make available to people on our investor website.
Perfect. Well, Brad, thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to the next update. And stay safe.
Thank you so much. Appreciate your time.